Now, today I wanted to talk about bouncing in balls, and because of how the problem set is timed, I also want to talk a bit about what I call the feeling of acceleration, so the experiences you have on amusement park rides, such as roller coasters, associated with acceleration. So I'll do my best to get to both of them. That may be overly ambitious, and I'll deal with that as it comes. So, ball sports and bouncing. I really have sort of two sections on ball sports. The first is on this mechanical effect of bouncing. The second is on, later down, on the interactions of balls with air, because in ball sports, those two effects, the bouncing of balls and the interaction of balls with air, are sort of the dominant physics issues, and hopefully relevant to the real world for you guys. So my introductory question associated with bouncing balls is, if you place a tennis ball on top of a basketball and drop the stack, how high does the tennis ball, so this sort of thing, if I drop this stack, how high is the tennis ball going to bounce? Will it come back to its original height, give or take a smidge? Will it go much higher than its original height, much lower than its original height during the bounce? You okay with the question? How many think that it will go to approximately its original height? How many think it will go much higher than its original height? How many think it will go much lower than its original height? Okay, so the bulk of you are going for higher. So, okay, I'll show you. So, they make toys, actually, that are stacks of one ball on top of another. And they go, the top ball goes incredibly high and sort of inevitably gets lost, and then you got a shorter stack, and so on. Woo! Yeah, thanks. And, where does that come from? In effect, the tennis ball is bouncing not off the floor. This is actually probably the world's oldest tennis ball. It's got almost no bounce left to it, which is part of the topic for today. But because it bounced off of a ball that was itself bouncing, in effect, the tennis ball bounced off a rising surface. It was batted upward. Well, we're doing it again. Yeah, it's batted upward. So part of the story for today is bouncing off of sort of immovable surfaces like the floor. It's not going anywhere. Is fairly straightforward, but it's not the only type of bounce that's relevant to your world. There are also bounces off of surfaces that get involved in the bounce process in a variety of ways. For example, they are themselves bouncy surfaces like a trampoline, or they're moving like a baseball bat or your leg when you kick a soccer ball, and that affects the bounce. So that's where we're going. Any questions on all this, as we go into this? All right, so some observations about balls in general. Some of them bounce well, some of them bounce poorly. I just, for whatever reasons, I tend to call balls that bounce extremely well lively balls. I guess this dates back beyond me. It's not me anthropomorphizing the balls, it's somebody else. So they're lively. The ones that don't bounce well, you can talk about them. I talk about them as dead balls. They just don't. Okay, I can show you in advance. This is a lively ball, bounces reasonably well. This ball, astonishingly dead, carefully engineered so that it barely bounces at all. Flock. You can't get it to bounce. Okay, what else? Balls bounce differently from different surfaces. The surface is often important. And finally, when the object that the ball is bouncing off of is moving, that still further affects the bounce. It's still a bounce, but it's just different. Okay, so my collection of questions starts off with, why doesn't a ball rebound to its original height? And we'll go on from there. Then it moves through the issues of how does the surface and the surface's movement affect the ball. So that first question is the one about, why doesn't a ball bounce to its original height? And to sort of begin to understand this, think about when when a soft, elastic ball drops off a rigid surface. So soft means that it's capable of denting. It's not There's no such thing as a totally rigid ball. But this one's obviously soft enough to dent. When it encounters a cement floor, for example, but this is basically cement with the tiles on it, plastic tiles. When it encounters that surface, neither object is truly a single rigid thing. From the perspective of the ball, its own surface is movable a little bit. So if you imagine as I dent the ball surface in, it's not a single object, it's sort of multiple pieces. It's the bulk of the ball and that surface that's moving. So which one gets the most dent? The ball, the floor, or both of them about equally? You okay with the question? So how many think that it's the ball that gets all the denting for practical purposes? How many think that it's the floor that gets the denting? And how many think that it's both of them about equally? Okay, so the majority are going for the ball only, but there are a number of people going for both the ball and the floor. And the floor, because it's not truly rigid, will dent a tiny bit, but it's way stiffer than the ball is. And what that means is when the two of them encounter each other, here's a model for the floor. When the ball encounters the floor and they push hard against each other for some reason, in fact, having to do with inertia, the floor isn't going to dent very much. It's just too stiff. And so the ball is going to do the total lion's share of the denting. So if we could take high-speed photography of this, which I guess I should do once historically, way back when I didn't have the right equipment. Now I've got equipment I could conceivably do that. You'd see that the ball will be seriously smushed inward, and the floor will look unscathed, even if you throw the ball down pretty hard against it. And the point of that is that during that encounter between the ball and the floor, they push hard on each other, and who's doing work on whom? The floor doesn't actually do any work on the ball, but it pushes up as the ball continues to move forward. From the ball's perspective, its surface is pushed inward. And that process does work on the ball's surface. Where did the energy come from? It came out of the ball's kinetic energy. The ball was moving forward and it encountered a sort of a non-movable surface that pushed inward on its own surface, dented the ball, and the ball will have changed shape and will have converted energy from energy of motion into energy somewhat in the bending of the ball. That's the main issue to recognize, is that when the ball hits the ground like this, during that moment of impact, which is too short to really dwell on, at least visually, the ball will be briefly motionless. You can imagine that. Just think the ball is heading downward, purely downward, and then moments later it's heading purely upward, and it didn't go around in some complicated path. It must have come to a stop momentarily. And during that stopped period, it had no kinetic energy. Where did its energy go? It was stored in the ball's surface, in the bending of that surface, like a spring. So it's not that different conceptually from this process. So I've got a familiar coil spring. If I drop this on the floor, it bounces pretty nicely. During the impact, the floor pushed inward on the spring. The spring was heading downward. So the energy involved in this, what seems to be a work process, really came from the spring's motion. It went into the spring's elastic store of energy stored in the bent spring, compressed spring. All right? So when I drop the spring on an immovable surface, the story involves 5 steps. The energy story is 5 steps. First, it's gravitational potential energy when it's way up high. Then it goes faster. When I drop it, imagine my hand's not in this. I'm just slowing the story down. It goes faster and faster and faster. Right before it hits, all that energy that was formerly gravitational potential energy is now kinetic energy in the spring's motion. It's been transformed internally. Then at the moment of impact, of deepest impact, the spring actually comes to a stop. It has no kinetic energy. It's down low. It has no significant gravitational potential energy. Where's the energy? It's in the spring, in the forces within the spring. Elastic potential energy. It takes work to smush a spring inward. I'm pushing inward, it's moving inward. I did work on it, and I let that work out. So energy went from gravitational to kinetic to elastic, and then it jumps back off the surface as the restoring forces push outward on the spring, and it transforms its elastic potential energy back into kinetic. It leaves the surface traveling fast now in the upward direction and leaps back up to some height. Questions about that idea? I've never done it with a spring before, but it's perfectly reasonable. It bounces just fine. And it bounces almost back to its original height. What does that mean? It means that the energy was pretty well handled by all these steps without wasting it as thermal energy. It wasn't lost significantly. So it went from gravitational to kinetic to elastic to kinetic to gravitational, and it's pretty much all there. You know, it doesn't quite come back to my hands, but it comes close. Part of it's going into crazy motion, rotation, not. So what to do from this? The same thing's going on in a ball. A ball is not technically a spring because of its shape is too complicated for it to have. It doesn't obey Hooke's law properly, okay? So you don't use it to weigh things, but that's okay. It still has the capacity to store energy and return energy. The extent to which it stores and returns energy determines how lively that ball is. A ball that returns energy nicely, that doesn't waste much, like this guy, supposedly, it's not as lively as it could be. There are balls that are a little better than that. But that means that during the denting process and undenting process, nearly all of the energy that went into the ball in deforming it remained in some elastic potential energy form and came back out as the ball jumped off the surface. In a ball like this, which is virtually dead, the work done on denting that surface is just lost, is turned completely into thermal energy and is unavailable for a rebound. So that's what's determining how lively balls are, is their ability to store and return energy during an impact. Is that okay? And it turns out that so this is just my story. This is me writing out the same things I just told you about. The key point is the missing energy after the bounce is thermal energy. Just to name a few things, the energy that was present in the movement of the ball, the kinetic energy of the ball, not its rotation, but its translational kinetic, I call that the collision energy, the energy that was basically invested into forms other than kinetic during the collision. So the ball had a certain kinetic energy before the collision. At the deepest moment of the collision, the kinetic energy is reduced by how much? The collision energy. That's the investment. And the amount that returns of the reappearing kinetic energy, the increase in kinetic energy that occurs during the rebound, I call it the rebound energy. So the rebound energy is always less than or ideally equal to the collision energy. You can't make energy out of nothing, and unless there's some secret store of energy in the ball, it's got a wound spring inside or something like that, or I won't even. No secret stores of energy. I was going to say explosive, but not a good topic for today. The ball can't leap up higher than it started. It can't summon energy out of nowhere. So the rebound energy is less than the collision energy. In any real ball, you never get all the collision energy back. Some of it is wasted. The best balls come close to perfect return, but they don't get there. The missing energy is thermal. It's okay? So you've all seen bounced balls on hard, immovable surfaces. The balls bounce with different degrees of liveliness. The ones that are the most lively are the ones that store and return energy the best, that basically have the largest rebound energy for a given collision energy. The ratio of those two is close to 1. Okay? That said, balls, you can measure the liveliness of a ball in two related but different ways. And why point these out? It's because virtually all ball sports are regulated. If they're going to be, if they're going to have any sort of consistency from game to game, and if you're going to have records and stuff and competitions, you want some control over how the ball behaves. If you don't, lots of effort will go into gaming the game by playing with the ball's behavior. So balls their liveliness is regulated. For example, baseballs are regulated very tightly to have a certain bounciness. And the way that you can characterize that bounciness, there are two choices. One of them is the ratio of the rebound energy to collision energy. That is the fraction of energy that comes back after a bounce off an immovable surface. And the reason I'm putting a movable surface in is because you don't want to study the surface. You want the surface to be sort of as passive as possible. So make it immovable, rigid, not involved in the bounce. So you can look at the ratio of energy that comes back, which I call the energy ratio, which will never be more than 1, and it's never going to actually be equal to 1 either for any real ball. The alternative is something known as the coefficient of restitution. It's a complicated name. I didn't make it up. But that one tends to be the one that is used in ball sports. It's a ratio that compares, it's still a ratio, the rebound speed to the collision speed. That is how fast the ball approached the surface compared to how fast the ball left the surface. And you divide the leaving speed over the arriving speed. So the leaving speed is always less than the arriving speed, so the coefficient of restitution is never more than 1. So typically less. And for a baseball, it's quite a bit less. It's regulated to be about 0.55, as I recall. So that means this is a vertical bounce, but a bounce off of a cement wall, I won't do it. I've done enough denting. But if it went in there at 100 miles an hour, then I would get a contract with Major League Baseball briefly until I threw my arm out. And then 100 miles an hour in, it would come back at about 55 miles an hour. That's what a coefficient of restitution of 0.55 means. It means for every 1 mile an hour in, you get 0.55 back. Does that follow? There is a relationship between the coefficient of restitution and the energy ratio. Because kinetic energy is proportional to speed squared, the energy ratio is equal to the coefficient of restitution squared. The coefficient of restitution is a speed ratio. The energy ratio is an energy ratio. If you square a speed ratio, you get an energy ratio. And so for a baseball, the speed coming back is about 55% of the incoming speed. But the energy coming back is only 55% of 55%, which is about a quarter. So you only get about a quarter of the energy back when a baseball bounces off a rigid surface. That's actually a sensible choice for the game of baseball, because if the ball was livelier than that, the ball would come out fantastically fast off things like a baseball bat. And it would change the sport dramatically. And people have tried to make the ball bouncier in various ways and sort of skirt these rules. That's part of in that is the stories of people playing with the bat, which get the bat involved in the bounce, or trying to, I suppose, have juiced balls. There have been years in which people say, oh, the balls are different this year. The game is all different. The same is going to be true of all the other ball sports. You can play with them and make them more or less bouncy. And they have to be regulated, otherwise people will do that. All right? So, just to have you think a little bit about the energy ratio versus the coefficient of restitution. If a ball's energy ratio is 0.5, that is the rebound energy divided by the collision energy is 0.5, how high will it bounce relative to the height from which it was dropped? So if I start with a ball, this one's probably got an energy ratio of close to 0.5. If I drop it from this height, how high will it come back up if it retains half of its energy during a bounce? How many think A, it'll go back to full height? How many think B, it'll go to half height? How many think C, it'll go to quarter height? Okay, a handful for the quarter height, but mostly it's for half height. And half height is the right answer It's actually, this guy's a little bit less than 0.5. It's going about 0.3 or 4. The reason that if it retains half of its energy, it goes to half of its height, is because height is the height it has above the floor is directly proportional to its gravitational potential energy above the floor. If it goes to this height, the half height that is, it's got half the gravitational potential energy of this height, full height. So if it rebounds to half height, it has half of its original gravitational potential energy. And that means that during the whole process of falling, hitting, rebounding, rising, if it goes back to half height, that means it retained half of its energy between the impact, the moment before the impact, and the moment after the impact. It retained half of its energy in usable form, kinetic energy, for example. The other half has been squandered as thermal energy. And you hear it as sound and everything else. It's just blasted out as useless stuff. So long and short, is a half. If the energy ratio is a half, the ball bounces to half height. It's very easy to measure energy ratios. You just drop the ball on a rigid, immovable surface and measure what fraction of rebound you get, just in height. And that tells you what fraction of energy you got during the rebound. Questions? Just then to the alternative is this one. If a ball's coefficient of restitution is a half, that is the speed ratio, how fast it travels after the bounce, divided by its speed before the bounce. The speed it approached the surface before the bounce. If that's a half, how high will it rebound relative to its original end? Baseball. Baseball has about a coefficient of restitution of about 0.5. Technically, it should be a little higher, but not much. So will it go to, how many think A, it'll go to full height? How many think B, it'll go to half height? How many think C, it'll go to 1/4 height? It is about C. This guy, because it comes off at half of its incoming speed, it only bounces to about 1/4 its original height. It just loses 3/4 of its energy. And it doesn't bounce well at all. By design. All right? So that's the story of bouncing at that level. Now, let's get the surface involved. So up to this point, when I've been careful in my language, I've had the ball bounce off of a rigid, immovable surface, one that simply pushes on the ball surface during the impact, dents the ball, allows it to try to store energy or not, and then rebound. If the surface itself can dent, it participates in the bounce. And in that case, as the two hit each other, they both push on each other equally hard in opposite directions. That's Newton's third law. The ball pushes on the floor, for example. The floor has to push on the ball equally hard in the opposite direction. They're a pair. And if both of them can dent, both of them have work done on their surfaces. So if you zoom in there and you look, you see, wow, the ball's being dented inward. That's work. There's the issue of from whose perspective, and I'm going to sweep that under the rug because it gets messy. I mean, it's a nuisance to deal with that. So the ball gets dented, and the floor, now, if you've got a soft floor, a playground that has a rubbery surface for kids, it's soft. You drop something like a bowling ball on it, it's going to dent seriously. So it gets pushed inward and moves inward. It's having work done on it. And now it's pretty straightforward to see that their work is really being done. That anybody looking there will go, wow, that surface is being pushed inward and it's moving inward. Work is being done. Okay, so they both get parts of the energy during the impact. They both are responsible for handling their portions of the collision energy. And during the rebound, they may well reinvest that energy into the two objects. Well, if the floor is still, it's not rigid, but it's still immovable. It's not going to go anywhere. So it's going to be involved in the bounce in terms of storing energy and returning it, but not in terms of moving away and carrying off the energy permanently. It's just involved in the, I'll take some of that energy and give it back to you, ball. Okay? Hope that helps. I don't know. Help, whatever. So, how how much of the energy goes into those two objects, the ball and the floor, depends on how far they dent. If they dent equally far, which means they're equally stiff, they share it equally. So the amount of work that is done on each surface is the force exerted on it times the distance it moves. So if they move the same distance, or equal distances, I should say, they'll have equal work done on them. So if a rubber ball, hits a rubber floor made of the same rubber, they'll probably dent equally far. And they'll have equal works done on them. So half the collision energy will go into the ball, and half of it will go into the floor. Is that okay? And then they can try to return it. And different surfaces have different liveliness. So they're both made of the same rubber, it's probably the same. So that's boring. But what if you take a ball that's very lively and a surface that's very dead, and you let them share the collision energy and return it, and the dead surface just says, well, I'm just going to walk away with that energy as thermal energy. It's gone. You'll never see it again. In that case, the bounce may be really crummy, even if the ball is a lively ball. So for example, here's the lively ball off of a rigid, immovable surface. Now let me drop it off of a immovable but not rigid surface, sand. Right? The ball doesn't bounce. Thunk. What happened? Well, the sand is actually softer than the ball surface. So when they push on each other, the sand does virtually all the denting, receives almost all the collision energy. So if you do the balance, the ball got maybe 2%, the sand got 98%. And sand is very dead stuff. You do work on it, great, it dents. You try to get it to rebound, no rebound. And the consequence then is the ball doesn't bounce. So almost nothing bounces off of soft sand. And just your public service announcement stuff, this is why running, playing volleyball, whatever you want to do in soft sand is exhausting. Every time you land on it, thunk, you dent into it and do work on it, and that work is gone. Thermal energy, you never get it back. The alternative would be running on a springy surface. This is what gymnasts do. The floor on which the gymnasts do all their acrobatics is not sand. It actually has springs in it that take the collision energy and return it to the gymnast and allow them to do things they can't do on a cement floor. Okay? So you can have a lively ball hitting a dead surface that's softer than the ball, and all the energy is squandered in the surface. There's the opposite is true. If you take a ball that's extremely dead, so a beanbag is like basically a sack of sand. It doesn't bounce at all. And that funny dead ball that I've got is equivalent. But this guy will not bounce off of a rigid, immovable surface. But if you bounce it off of a surface that is immovable but soft, so it takes a large fraction of the collision energy, but lively, you can make even a beanbag bounce. Not very well. I mean, this is things short on air. Right? You get the idea, I hope. My favorite example of this is a trampoline. People are, if you think of yourself as a ball, you are not a lively ball. You do not bounce well at all. So when you're dropped on things, you usually just go, right? But if you're dropped on a soft, elastic surface like a trampoline, most of the collision energy goes into the trampoline, or the bounce house, and is rebounded, is returned to you. So a lively surface can make a human beings bouncy. Okay? Just sort of, I get another public service announcement aspect of this whole story. Aluminum bats. I don't know what the current status of talk about aluminum bats are, but there's always been the idea of using aluminum bats in baseball, or some leagues allow aluminum bats, some don't. Whatever. What's the point? Well, an aluminum bat, unlike a wood bat, I should say, first, wood bats are very hard surfaces. They dent very little during the impact between a baseball and a wood bat. Therefore, the ball is responsible for nearly all of the bouncing effect. And I'll talk shortly about bouncing off a moving bat. But whether the bat's moving or not doesn't affect this part of the story. Namely, that when the ball and bat collide, the ball does all the denting and is responsible for all the collision energy, maybe apart from 2%. You know, it's a trivial amount that goes into the wood bat. Therefore, it's a relatively dead ball. It doesn't bounce well. What's the alternative? Make a bat that's bouncy like a trampoline. You can make a dead ball like a baseball bounce well. So if you're swinging this trampoline, it doesn't matter what they throw at it. It could be a beanbag. It will still bounce nicely. And so that's what's happened with aluminum bats. They can get engineered more and more technically sophisticated, so they become very effective trampolines for a baseball. And they really boost the bounce. Those trampolines, the aluminum trampolines, basically store energy nicely. Because they are designed to be relatively soft compared to the ball surface, they dent a lot. They receive a large fraction of the collision energy, and they return it beautifully. And they make the ball go off faster, and they completely change, well, they potentially change the game. So that's why they haven't entered into Major League Baseball. In part, they would completely change the game, and in part, they're dangerous in that circumstance. You'd want to be like pitching from behind a armored plate. I mean, you have pitchers with holes in them all the time. Okay? Any questions? You're rambling away. It's a quiet day. Too wet. Too wet to talk. Too wet to think. All right. So I've talked about balls bouncing off of rigid immovable surfaces, balls bouncing off of immovable but not so rigid surfaces. How about if the surface moves? And so my question leading into this is, how does a moving bat drive a ball forward? And a way to think about this, finally, the collision is now between two moving objects, a moving bat and a moving ball. It's still a bounce, though. They still bounce off each other. But following how that's a bounce is a little trickier. If bouncing off bats doesn't catch your fancy, think about kicking a soccer ball, and the ball is bouncing off your ankle. It's still a bounce, even though your foot is moving forward. They're bouncing off each other, and they still have the same story of each one stores energy or receives some fraction of the collision energy and is responsible possibly for returning some fraction of it. And depending on how bouncy they are, you get different amounts of rebound. In order to talk about a situation where both objects are moving now, so it's not just the ball moving into an immovable surface like a wall or a floor, but rather the ball moving into a moving surface like a bat or an ankle, we have to pay attention to both objects' motion. And so there's a speed not of the ball itself, but of the two objects approaching each other. And this is, I'll talk about this in a minute, it's something of a frame of reference issue, that if the bat is moving, say, to your left at 50 miles an hour, and the ball is moving to your right at 50 miles an hour, they are approaching each other at 100 miles an hour. And how do you do this? Well, you can sort of take the perspective of the bat and notice that from the bat's perspective, the ball is coming especially fast, because not only is the ball moving to your right, the bat itself is moving to your left. They're having a head-on collision. So there's a speed of approach, and then there's a speed of separation. Other than that, that renaming is mainly a frame of reference idea. It's just thinking differently about how these objects are approaching each other and separating from each other. Nothing much else changed. The coefficient of restitution is the same idea. The speed of approach, it's the reverse. It's the speed of separation divided by the speed of approach. A baseball has a coefficient of restitution of 0.5 or 0.55 in that concept. So it's still a bounce. And now to walk you through that bounce, I will do the following. Well, first I'll ask you some questions about this idea of collisions where both objects are moving. If two cars are traveling at 50 miles an hour and 60 miles an hour, or the reverse, 60 and 50 miles an hour, that's their speed, respectively, according to a pedestrian. When they collide, their collision speed will be, and let me make sure this is clear. I've specified that one car is traveling 60 miles an hour. I didn't say which direction. I specified the other car is traveling 50 miles an hour, also without any reference to direction. To someone, this is the observation of someone standing on the sidewalk watching these cars go by. If they were to collide, what would their collision speed be, their approach speed, how fast they're going toward each other? You understand the question, or questions on the question? How many think that their collision speed will be 110 miles an hour? Okay. How many think that it'll be between 50 miles an hour and 60 miles an hour? Okay. How about between 10 miles an hour and 110? So now we're getting, this is the majority right at that point. And how about between 0 and 60? Okay, so there are a handful outside of the 0, 10 to 110. And it is actually, it is C, that the 10 and 110. So where did those two numbers come from? How do you get a 10 mile an hour collision between two cars traveling that fast? What are they doing? One is hitting the other from behind. So you've got the 60 mile an hour car heading off towards, I always say Richmond, so I'm going to pick something else. Nova, right? Whatever. 60 miles an hour. That's the 50 mile an hour car. And coming up behind the 50 mile an hour car is the 60 mile an hour car also heading towards Nova. And it gets closer and closer and closer and bumps. The speed at which these two cars approach is, in this case, the difference in their speeds, 10 miles an hour. That's all. So it's a fender bender. And this stuff happens. High-speed collisions, that is collisions in which both cars are traveling super fast, but they're traveling in the same direction and almost the same speed. Those are very minor impacts. This happens in race cars all the time, right? Where they bump one another just a little bit, and even though they're going 150 miles an hour, it's no big deal. It's not. I mean, I'm sure it's not fun, but it's not a disaster. The alternative, the other extreme I talked about, is 110 miles an hour. How do you get 110 mile an hour collision speed? Head on. One's going one way, one's going away from Nova, the other's going toward Nova. And now, from either one car's perspective, the other car's coming at them really fast. And you've seen this in a car. You've watched cars go by you in the other lane heading the opposite direction. That crossing speed is tremendous. So in this case, it's the sum of the two speeds. 60 plus 50 is 110. Very fast travel back. And you can get everything in between by just choosing angles. From head-on is 110, head-on to overtaking, which is 10, and everything in between is possible. Now into the collision energy, the energy that's made available by the impact between these two cars when they hit. What range of possibilities is there? So it's the same impacts, the overtaking impact versus the head-on impact. How much so the release of energy out of kinetic energy vary over what possible range? You okay with the question? How many think that it extends over a range of 5/6? That is the maximum, minimum are separated by 5/6. How about maximum, minimum are separated by 6/5? How about a factor of 10? How about a factor of 121? Boy, low voting. Oh, okay, because it's hard to pose the question well. It's actually D, 121. And so just explaining this was worth the trouble. That when two cars collide in one of these overtaking fender benders, their approach speed, the speed at which the two cars approached one another, was only 10 miles an hour. And an object's, so if you imagine from the perspective of the car being overtaken, there's another car coming at them at 10 miles an hour, and it hits and bumps, and suppose it releases all the kinetic energy of that impact as something, I don't know, noise, hopefully. Well, it was only traveling 10 miles an hour as viewed from the car in front. And the kinetic energy is proportional not to speed, but to speed squared. So it's the energy released in this accident was proportional to 10 mile an hour squared, which is 100 square miles an hour, whatever that strange unit is. There's more to it than that, but it's a factor of 100 grand total. How about if they hit head on? If they hit head on now from the perspective of one of the cars, the other car is coming at them not at 10 miles an hour anymore, but at 110. And the energy released in that is proportional to the square of that 110. So square of 110, I mean, that's like 12,100 or something. That's a huge number. It is 121 times as large as the overtaking collision. Because the difference in speeds, the ratio of the differences in speeds is a factor of 11. The difference in ratios of energy is a factor of 11 squared, which is 121. That's where the 121 comes from. Vaguely followable or questions you want to ask about it? It's a silent class, but yeah, whatever. This is why head-on collisions are so much worse than overtaking collisions. You know, given a choice, in that split second before hitting the car in front of you in your lane and veering into the oncoming lane and picking one of the cars coming at you from the opposite direction, don't go for the opposite direction cars. The approaching speed is significantly higher, and the energy release in the process is up by a just enormous factor. So hitting the car in front of you at 60 miles an hour when they're going 58, I mean, assuming you retain control of your car, that is the way to go. Any questions about that situation? I mean, hopefully you'll never be faced by such a decision. What you going to hit? You want to hit the thing that's traveling toward you the slowest, not the thing that's traveling the fastest. I mean, and it's mass matters, as we've talked about with bumper cars, but not as much as the speed difference, except in extreme situations. Okay, so now I can give you the story of how a baseball bounces off of a moving bat. And I'm going to do it, in my experience, the best approach to do this is 3 steps. And initially we're going to have it's going to be from your perspective initially, but then we're going to take some interesting perspectives on the collision. So imagine that you've got the situation I've drawn up here, and it's in the book, where the pitcher has thrown a 100 kilometer per hour ball towards home plate. It's going to, and the batter is now swinging the bat towards the pitcher that is away from home plate, also at 100 kilometers an hour. So you've got a ball moving towards home plate, as viewed by the fans. You all are the fans. The ball is moving toward home plate. The bat is moving away from home plate, or say toward the pitcher, outfield. They're approaching each other from the perspective of the fans. Is that okay? How fast are they approaching each other? You can tell me, right? Or at least think about it yourself. It's 200 kilometers an hour. If you were a bug sitting on the bat, you would and moving out toward the outfield, you would see this ball rushing toward you much faster than the fans see it. The fans see the ball moving 100 kilometers an hour, but to the bug on the bat, it's a head-on collision. This is going to be 200 kilometers an hour. Whoa, big trouble coming up, okay? You okay with the 200 kilometers an hour? Okay, so the collision speed is 200 kilometers an hour. Now, the impact between the ball and the bat is, let's just be the bug on the bat again. The ball comes in at 200 kilometers an hour, and it bounces. And let's let the bat be a rigid wood bat. It's not going to do much, except just let the ball bounce off of it. In that case, the ball goes off, since the coefficient of restitution of a baseball is about 0.55, it comes in at 200 kilometers an hour, it goes out at about 110. You okay with where I got the 110 from? This is how a ball bounces. It's not bouncing off the floor anymore, it's bouncing off a bat, in at 200, out at about 110. That's as viewed by the bug on the bat. Whoa, it came in at 200 kilometers an hour, bounce. Out it goes at 110. Okay? Now we go back to the fans' point of view, you guys. And from your point of view, you notice two things. The bat is still going out towards the outfield at 100 kilometers an hour, and the bug on it is also going 100 kilometers an hour. You ask the bug, so bug, how fast is the ball going as you see it? The bug says, 110 kilometers an hour that way. So from the fan's point of view, your point of view, you have to add those two speeds. The bat is going 100, and the ball is outrunning the bat by another 110. And if you add them, 100 plus 110, that's 210. The ball is going toward the outfield at 210 kilometers per hour. Questions about where I pulled that number out from? And it's not out of a total rabbit out of a hat. It's thoughtful. That's the fastest speed in the story, 210 kilometers. The ball is going very fast. And this started with a bat moving 100 kilometers an hour, a ball moving 100 kilometers an hour. Woof! Out of seemingly nowhere, you showed up with a speed that's 210 kilometers an hour. The ball is going very fast. And it all works out. It was a bounce off of a moving object. And that's, ultimately, that's why the tennis ball, remember this story? The ball and these two balls weren't not traveling very fast when they hit the ground. And yet, because the tennis ball hit the ball, the basketball, effectively while the basketball was rebounding, it was batted up in the air, just like a baseball bat hitting a baseball. And off it went. If these two balls were perfectly lively, and the big ball had way more mass than the little ball, in principle, you can send the little ball off at 9 times, to 9 times its original height. It was a huge increase. So any questions about the bounce of a baseball off of a bat? This shows up not only in baseball, but when you kick a ball, same thing. It's bouncing off of a moving foot. And the two bounce, you can get a speed that was bigger than any speed in the story up until that point. Last piece about bouncing balls. First, an aside, I needed to talk, in order to have you guys complete the problem set on Wednesday, I needed to talk about acceleration, the feeling acceleration. I didn't get there, so I'm going to delay the problem set until Friday, okay? I don't want to take it any further than that because the midterm will show up. But okay, so the problem set will be due on Friday, not on Wednesday. But don't leave yet. Yes, wow, school's out. Yes, I'll look after it. I'm thinking of Charlie Brown doing his homework some other day. What I wanted to show you is this: that not only can baseball, a moving bat, introduce interesting effects on the ball, but the ball can cause interesting effects on the bat. So I talked about a ball bouncing off of an immovable, rigid object, the floor. Then I talked about the ball bouncing off of a immovable but flexible surface, like trampolines. Then I talked about the ball bouncing off of a movable and flexible object, like a baseball bat. Now, let's look at the bat's participation in the bounce. It's not all about the ball. The bat gets a bounce too, because it's got a limited mass and it's got a limited stiffness. Stuff happens to it. So the one I want to pay attention to, there are things that happen to the handle that make it funny when you hit the ball, depending on where you hit it. But the one that's most probably significant is different parts of the bat, when you hit them, you cause the bat itself to vibrate. And the bat, although it doesn't look like quite the same, is basically a stick like this with some structure in it, right? It's got one end, that might be the handle end, that might be the business end. This is simplified, but it can do motions of its own, about its own equilibrium shape. Its equilibrium shape is straight, but it can bend this way and that way. This is the motion of the tine of a xylophone. You've had Fisher-Price one. The kids down the street had a Fisher-Price xylophone, right? This is the motion you are causing when you smack that baby with a mallet. And it's supported at the parts that don't move, which are what are known as nodes. We'll talk about that down the end of the semester. But you get this motion, see it? The flapping motion. The bat can do the flapping motion too. It's a little bit more complicated because the shape isn't so nicely uniform. But if you play it with a mallet, it's basically, we're back to Fisher-Price xylophone. If you hit it in the middle, playing. In the end, you can. But if you hit it right there, which is basically the support for where the xylophone support would go, what's known as the node, it's a special spot, the part that doesn't move when it flaps, you get a crack sound instead of a buzz. You hear the difference? I can hit as hard as I like, no buzz. You hit the end. I'm damping with my hand. I got to hold it. I can't. I'm not getting quite. There we go. You hear the bzz, bzz. It's not there. Back. This is. You can break a bat by hitting it on the label because you'll really make it flap hard, and that flap just takes it right beyond its limit and breaks it. But if you hit it right on this special spot, there's no flapping. And those of you who played baseball or softball, you know when you hear this sound, the ball is well hit. Not a lot of energy went into the bat's musical tone. Most of it went into the ball, and the ball's going to go far. So people listen. They listen for the crack of the bat, and they go back out farther to catch the ball if they hear the crack.